YouTube. So today we're going to focus on the idea of religion. This video will be in a similar vein to some other videos that I've done that I have a playlist on that I've called The Meaning of Words because it is fascinating to me the way people understand and use words, and how the meaning of words changes, and even if the meaning of words haven't changed, people will, use words incorrectly because of just how they hear it used in everyday speech. So this video is going to be in a similar vein to that, although I do not consider this really focusing on the meaning of a word. This is more the perspective and understanding of what we consider something like a religion. So this isn't going to be around the definition of the word religion, although we'll touch on that. This is more so, what do we actually consider religion? What do we consider someone, when we think of someone who is quote unquote religious, what does that mean? Is there a focused meaning behind that? And what is a religion, and how do religions typically manifest themselves, or how do they look across the world? And the reason we're looking into this today is because honestly, I find this fascinating. I find this so interesting, the perspective that people have when they hear certain words or they think about certain topics. Is what they're thinking about actually accurate? Or, is there a different perspective that people need to have? Or is there another perspective that you can have? And so what we're going to focus today is on religion, what we consider religion, specifically on the perspective of Buddhism. You know, I think Buddhism, let me preface all of this. I am not a Buddhist. I do not believe in Hinduism. I'm not a Muslim. I'm not trying to promote Buddhism. I'm not trying to promote any other religion. I am a Christian, particularly of the Protestant variety. So that is my worldview. I have a biblical, my worldview is grounded in the Bible and the teachings of Jesus Christ. However, I find other religions fascinating. And today we're going to focus on Buddhism. Now why would I pick Buddhism, and why would this video focus on Buddhism and how it relates to religion and things like that? Because it should be obvious. Buddhism is one of the major religions around the world. Well, just so you don't have to wait till the end of the video, in my personal opinion, and I think a lot of people would agree with this, maybe even some Buddhists would agree with this, I don't think Buddhism is a religion. I think Buddhism is a philosophy. I think it is a way of life and a mindset that has a goal that really has nothing to do with the worship or the prayer to or veneration of a deity. And we'll get into that, but that's why I think this is actually a very interesting video, because the perspective of this is going to come from, particularly a Western perspective, and more specifically, a Westerner's perspective in the United States, who may be a Christian in the United States, because there's a lot of those in the United States. And so when your average Christian in the United States, when you think of other world religions, and I have on the screen here, I've just Googled the major world religions, and it has pretty much every religion or umbrella term for religions, which is another interesting topic that we'll get into a little bit in this video. But it has them listed out. So you have Buddhism, Hinduism, folk religions. It's kind of interesting. Judaism, I think a lot of people are familiar with Judaism. Islam, I think a lot of people are familiar with Islam, whether you're a Muslim or not a Muslim. Shinto, Christianity, Sikhism, spiritualism. So when people think of the major world religions today, I think most people would agree, particularly Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, those would probably be the major world religions that you think of. And you can look down below here. Christianity 31% of the world's population, Islam, or almost 25% of the world's population, irreligious, so atheists or agnostic. I would assume that's what that means. Around 15, 16% of the world's population, Hinduism, 15%, Buddhism, 6.6%. Then I'm sure it goes down from there. But I mean, just what does that mean? What is a religion? And what's the difference between a religion and just any other ideology or a philosophy? And again, just so you don't have to wait to the end of the video, I do not believe Buddhism is a religion. I don't think it should be considered a religion. And the reason for that is basically words have meaning. And to be a religion or to be religious, that actually means something. So another funny thing that I hear people say a lot is, I believe in God, but I don't believe in religion. Or I believe in God, or I'm spiritual and I believe in God, but I renounce religion, or I'm not religious. Well, that's just a nonsensical statement. That doesn't mean anything. Literally, if you believe in God, that means you're religious. I mean, just for everybody that says that, here's the definition of religion. You can just Google it. Religion, the belief in and worship of a superhuman power or powers, especially a god or gods. A particular system of faith and worship. I mean, literally, if you believe in God, and you, that affects your life, it doesn't mean you have to be a part of a denomination or some man-made institution. That's conflating institution with religion. They're not necessarily the same thing. If you believe in God and that affects your life, you're religious. I mean, it's pretty much that simple. So people who say things like, I believe in God, but I'm not religious, or I believe in God, but I denounce religion. It's a nonsensical thing to say. It doesn't, you're literally just confusing words. But that's what a religion is. A religion, when you ask the average American or Protestant in the United States, because there's a lot of Protestants in the United States, they would think of other world religions as Islam and the Jewish faith, around the Talmud and the Torah, and Muslims and their faith around Muhammad and Allah and the Quran and the Hadith and all of that. Buddhism, what I find interesting, is very different from all of that. I would even argue Hinduism is a very different perspective on the world that we live in than either one of the Abrahamic religions. Now, I would still consider Hinduism as a religion per se, but there are overlaps between Hinduism and Buddhism. And I'll even say Hinduism is extremely interesting, because Hinduism is, to me, let me preface this again. I'm not an expert on Hinduism. I'm not an expert on Buddhism. I feel more comfortable talking about Buddhism than I do Hinduism. And the simple fact is, Hinduism seems to be an umbrella term for a lot of different belief systems that have a lot of overlap, but also can be very different. So it's not really, it's similar in the same way that an outsider's perspective on Christianity could be an umbrella term. Well, what form of Christianity do you mean? Are you talking about Catholicism? Are you talking about Eastern Orthodoxy? Are you talking about Protestants? What denomination within Protestantism? Are you talking about non-denominational? Are you talking about, Jehovah's Witnesses and other, offshoots of Christianity that, as a Protestant, I wouldn't consider some of the things that I named Christian. I would consider them offshoots of Christianity, or very, diversions from actual Christianity, such as Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses and things like that. So you could make the argument from an outsider's perspective that Christianity in and of itself is an umbrella term as well. Islam, you have, I think you have like Sunnis and the Shiites and different forms of Islam. Uh, you know, but Hinduism and Judaism, you could do the same thing as well. You have Orthodox Jews, you have Hasidic Jews, you have Reformed Orthodox Judaism. You have Jews that really focus on the Talmud, Jews that really focus on the Torah. There's umbrella terms you could look at from each perspective. But Hinduism, in my opinion, seems to be an umbrella term, but to a much greater degree than any of the other religions that I just named. Hinduism seems to have, again, from what I can tell, and I could be very wrong. And if you're a Hindu and you're listening to this channel, please correct me on anything that I'm saying. As well as if you're a Buddhist and you happen to come across this video, please correct me on anything that I'm saying. I'm trying to represent everything in a fair light. And really, this is just kind of looking at Buddhism and a perspective on Buddhism. It's not really I'm not trying to denounce Buddhism. I'm not trying to promote Buddhism. I just think it's an interesting perspective and an interesting ideology and an interesting philosophy that I think not a lot of people, particularly in the West, really, truly, fundamentally understand. But again, Hinduism, I digress a little bit, but Hinduism seems to be an umbrella term to a much greater degree than some of those other religions. But what, so when we look at other religions, what really constitutes a religion is a belief system around, theology, which is the study of God, which incorporates doctrines and decrees and things like that. So, if you're a Christian, you're familiar with the Ten Commandments. If you're a Christian, you're familiar with prayer and liturgy, particularly from an Eastern Orthodox or Catholic standpoint. But Protestants also do have liturgy as well. But it's really veneration and worship of to a deity, to God, what we would call God. And there are doctrines and decrees and things that are, define what is moral and what is immoral, and what is good and what is bad, and the nature of human beings and the fallen state of man, and evil in the world, and how to address it, and some of the some of the deviations of morality, getting into maybe where evil comes from, and where how it affects our lives and things like that, and the justification for morality and why we should live moral lives, and what is morality and what is not morality, things like that. Same thing with Islam. Hear of the 5 pillars of Islam, which is the first. I'm not going to try to pronounce that, but it's a profession of faith. This is the first pillar of Islam. Muslims bear witness to the oneness of God by reciting the creed. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. The second pillar of Islam, Salah, prayer, is the second pillar. The Islamic faith is based on the belief that individuals have a direct relationship with God. The world's Muslims turn individually and collectively to Mecca, Islam's holiest city, to offer 5 daily prayers at dawn, noon, and mid-afternoon, sunset, and evening. Zakat, I think that's how you pronounce that, is almsgiving, is the third pillar. Social responsibility is considered part of one's service to God. The obligatory act of zakat enshrines this duty. Zakat prescribes payment of fixed portions of a Muslim's possessions for the welfare of the entire community. There's Psalm. I think that's how you pronounce that, but it's fasting. And you fast during the holy month of Ramadan. This is the 4th pillar of Islam, ordained in the Holy Quran. The fast is an act of deep personal worship in which Muslims seek a richer perception of God. The Hijjah, I think I'm pronouncing that close. This is basically the pilgrimage to Mecca. This is the 5th pillar and the most significant manifestation of Islamic faith and unity in the world. For those Muslims who are physically and financially able to make the journey to Mecca, the Hijjah is once in a lifetime duty that is the peak of their religious faith. So, these are the 5 pillars of Islam. Many people outside of Islam are familiar with a lot of this, but it centers around reverence and worship of a deity, of God, of Allah, from the teachings of Muhammad. Muhammad is the messenger of God, and providing teachings via the Quran and things like that. Buddhism is not like any of that, in my opinion, from what I can tell. Buddhism, they have a very unique view of reality. They have a very unique view of, what we would call consciousness and who we are as a human being, and, the quote unquote self. They have a very unique view on, the meaning of life and the purpose of life. And really, I would argue that Buddhism, really the tenets within Buddhism, if that's what you want to call it, and what it teaches is not doctrine more so than it is a method. It's different. It's not, these things that have been decreed for the worship of a god to dictate someone's life, in reverence of a god, around prayer and worship and the understanding of God and things like that. Buddhism really doesn't have anything to do with that. Buddhism is a method for how to understand and live your life to reach the goal of nirvana and enlightenment. So, just to go over quickly about Buddhism, its founding, the original Buddha, and some of its core tenets. Again, I will say again, I'm not I'm not an expert on Buddhism, but I find it interesting in the reading and research that I've done around Buddhism over the last couple of years. I just find this extremely interesting. So, really, the start of Buddhism came from an individual who lived. It looks to be 500 to 400 years BC, and whose name was Siddhartha Gautama. And Siddhartha Gautama, the story goes and the traditions go that he was raised and born into a wealthy family in a kingdom that no longer exists. And his father really wanted him to be a king, but there was a prophecy about Siddhartha Gautama by sages before he was born that were told to his mother that your son will either be a great king, a great ruler, or he will be a holy man, an enlightened being. And so Siddhartha lived the first 30 plus years of his life in luxury and had everything given to him. He lived in a palace, and he had, all types of worldly possessions and things, and worldly livelihood that was provided to him via women and again, possessions and authority and things like that. But one day, the traditions go, he was taken outside of the palace, or outside of, where he typically lived his day-to-day life. And he went out into the general public. He was taken out into the general public, and he saw various stages of life of different people. So he saw a sick person, and he'd never been exposed to that. He saw an elderly person, and he'd never been exposed to that. He saw a corpse, and he had never been exposed to death. He just saw these different stages of life, and it shocked him. And he asked one of his confidants, what is this? What is going on with these people? And because he had no reference point or context for what was happening. And he was told, this is what happens to everybody. Everybody will grow old, and everybody is going to die in life. You will. It doesn't matter if you're rich, poor, whatever. Everyone will get sick at some point in their lives. Everyone will eventually die at some point in their lives. And so this kind of shook his core. And so, one night Siddhartha leaves his palace, leaves his wife, leaves his young son that had been recently born, and goes off into the world to seek answers to his questions. And so, what were the questions that Siddhartha Gautama had? His questions were really around the core teachings of Buddhism. And so you could also argue that Buddhism is a bit of an umbrella term. There are different variations of Buddhism and different things that are taught and different, you know, um, revered Buddhist teachings and teachers that have come along over the years. But really, the core teachings of Buddhism are around the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths leads you to the Eightfold Path. And we're going to go through some of these. But basically, high level 10,000 foot view, I'll read these. But really, the whole understanding of Siddhartha Gautama and the teaching of Buddhism is that life involves what Buddhism calls suffering. But I've read and seen various interpretations or translations of the actual Sanskrit word that is the first noble truth. And I've seen a lot of other Buddhists say, yeah, suffering's part of it, but that's not a full translation of the word. It can also mean disappointment or unsatisfaction. So it's not just purely suffering, because everything incorporates, and I believe the word is dukkha, and the word has many meanings in Sanskrit that aren't, suffering doesn't completely translate fully from the English to, from Sanskrit to the English. And again, that's just my, basic understanding. But really, everything is dukkha. Everything is suffering. Everything is disappointment. Because even if you achieve your goals, that won't last forever, and you'll eventually become disappointed in those goals and unsatisfied. There's sickness. There's happiness, but happiness doesn't last forever. There's, sadness. There's also wealth, but wealth doesn't last forever. There's also satisfaction, but satisfaction fades. So the entirety of life and life's experience is around disappointment, and the fact that Buddhists do teach reincarnation. So if you don't reach the ultimate goal of Buddhism, which is nirvana, and to become a Buddha, which is an enlightened being. I think Buddha translates to the awakened one, or one that is awake. So meaning that anybody could be a Buddha. A Buddha is just like Jesus Christ. That's a title. Christ is a title. It's not just just used for a specific individual. It's just a title. The Buddha or a Buddha is a title. It's just an enlightened person. So someone who is enlightened, they too are the Buddha or a Buddha. But this was the original Buddha. But really, the Buddhism is around the Four Noble Truths. The first is suffering, which we talked about. The second is the cause of suffering, or the thirst for desire. Desire is where a lot of suffering comes from, because you desire things, and you desire things in life, and that desire, even when you attain what you desire, it fades and all that. So the second noble truth is around suffering, is craving. I think another translation is thirst. The third noble truth is around, how do you end suffering? How do you end craving? How do you end the thirst? And then the fourth noble truth is the path that leads you to away from the suffering and the disappointment and the thirst, and basically overcoming overcoming the desires of life, and how to attain enlightenment. And so the fourth is the path. The fourth noble truth is the path which leads one away from craving and suffering, and the path is the Eightfold Path. It's right here, the Eightfold Path, which serves as both a guide on the road to non-attachment and the road itself. The precepts both inform a traveler on how to proceed and provide the way through spiritual discipline. The 8 precepts are right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. By recognizing the Four Noble Truths and following the Eightfold Path, a person could find release from craving and attachment to the things of the world, and liberate oneself from the endless cycle of suffering experienced through rebirth and death. So Buddhists teach reincarnation. The truths in the path are given varying levels of significance by different Buddhist schools in the present day, but remain foundational aspects of the faith in all of them. And so the point of going through a lot of this is, these are the main precepts of Buddhism. And what's interesting is none of this has anything to do with the worship of a deity. The Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, the original Buddha, was just a man who died. And the special quality of Siddhartha via Buddhist tradition, again, if you're a Buddhist and you hear this, correct me if I'm wrong, was that he became an enlightened being by finding the middle way, by not conforming to the religious practices of his day, which were around asceticism, which is basically still practiced in a lot of Hindu sects today around, laying on nails and over, denouncing the materialistic aspects of the world and denouncing, desires of food and eating very little food so that you don't become a glutton and all these things. But also, you're not overindulging in materialism, like a lot of people. Not overindulging in the luxuries of life or the luxuries that could be obtained in life, but finding the middle way. Not starving yourself, because then the body becomes the center focus of your life and holding the desires of the body back. And likewise, on the other end of the spectrum, not overindulging in the materialistic aspects and desires of life, but finding a middle way. And so that was a core tenet of the Buddhist teachings, which led to the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. And again, none of this has anything to do with worship of a deity. The Buddha himself was not a deity. He was a man. The special thing about him was he found the middle way, became an enlightened being, and therefore obtained nirvana and ceased to, he ended the cycle of reincarnation, living again so that you face all the suffering, and then dying again because you never became awakened, and living again, and then facing all the trials in life and suffering, and desire and all that, and then being born again and all that. The special thing about the Buddha, who was not a god, never claimed to be a god, never really, to my understanding, there's nothing around how Buddhists have to worship, the original Buddha or anything like that. Even though that they do, they'll go to temples and pray to statues and things like that. But there's no real, that's not a core tenet of the Four Noble Truths or the Eightfold Path. The whole point of Buddhism is to obtain enlightenment, to overcome suffering and the desires of life. And, again, I'm not trying to denounce Buddhism, and I'm not trying to promote Buddhism, but from my Western perspective, really the way that I would explain it to Christians or to other people in the West, the whole point of Buddhism is to cease to exist. Now, Buddhists may have a problem with that, but really, again, I'm not trying to denounce Buddhism or anything like that, because I think a lot of, if you get into the critiques and criticism of Buddhism, it's around nihilism. Buddhism seems very nihilistic. I don't really disagree with that, but even to not to really focus on that, but really what I look at from a 10,000 point view is the whole point of Buddhism is to cease to exist. Buddhists would say that enlightenment, which is nirvana, once you reach nirvana, it's not necessarily that you cease to exist. It's just like putting out a candle. Where did the flame go? Do you say that the flame went somewhere? So they would argue it's not necessarily the same thing as ceasing to exist, where I would say, yeah, that is the same thing as the flame doesn't exist anymore. It's no longer a part of our reality. The other areas where I would point out to anybody that I find interesting that would consider Buddhism a religion is Buddhism, outside of the fact that it's not really focused on a deity or the worship of a deity, or doesn't really have doctrines around any of that in theology. Buddhism doesn't really address or what, morality, or, the justification for morality, or the justification for evil, or where does evil come from. It doesn't really get into any of that. The whole point of Buddhism is to obtain nirvana. And here's just going through, again, very simple Google searches, so people don't think that I'm making a lot of this stuff up. What is the goal of Buddhism? The goal of Buddhism is to become enlightened and to reach nirvana. Nirvana is believed to be attained only with the elimination of all greed, hatred, and ignorance within a person. Nirvana signifies the end of the cycle of death and rebirth. You know, well, just to clarify nirvana even more, this is from Britannica. Nirvana in Indian religious thought, the supreme goal of certain meditation disciplines, although it occurs in the literature of a number of ancient Indian traditions, the Sanskrit term nirvana is most commonly associated with Buddhism, in which it is the oldest and most common designation for the goal of the Buddhist path. It is used to refer to the extinction of desire, hatred, and ignorance, and ultimately of suffering and rebirth. Literally, it means blowing out or becoming extinguished, as when a flame is blown out or a fire burns out. In his first sermon after the Enlightenment, the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, set forth the Four Noble Truths, one of the core teachings of Buddhism, the third of which was cessation. What is cessation? We'll get into that. This state of cessation of suffering is its causes is nirvana. The term nirvana has entered Western parlance to refer to a heavenly or blissful state. The European valuation of nirvana as a state of annihilation was the source of the Victorian characterization of Buddhism as a negative and life-denying religion. I don't necessarily disagree with that. I'm not going to say I completely agree with that, but what is cessation? Well, here's the definition of cessation. Cessation, noun, a ceasing or stopping, discontinuance, pause, temporary cessation of hostilities. It literally means that the point of Buddhism is to cease to exist. I think I would debate that with. I would debate people on that. Additionally, why would I, just to take it a step further, is the Buddhist view of reality. And this is where it gets interesting, in my opinion, because I don't really think the average Westerner or the average Christian or the average, religious person in the United States, particularly of Protestantism or something like that in the United States, they don't understand how different people's view of reality can be in other parts of the world. For example, Buddhists don't really believe that there is a self. So what we would call consciousness or myself, or the person that is speaking to you now via this microphone into a video, I don't really exist. The thing that I would look at as myself from a Western perspective, my consciousness, my ego, all that is really an illusion, which in turn means our reality is an illusion. Why is it an illusion? Because Buddhism teaches a form of emptiness, where really when you break everything down, all of my consciousness is really just a stream of experiences. And you can't really nail down the self into one singular thing. It is a combination of things. It is not only my brain, but it is my emotions. It's my experiences. It is my whatever's interpretation of the signals in my brain. I mean, I think a better way to look at it would be, well, what is a car? Is the car the wheels? Well, no. Is the car the rubber of the wheels? Well, no. Is the car the engine? No. Is the car the spark plugs in the engine? No. Is the car the windows? No. Then how can you say all of those things are the car when none of those things are the car? That's kind of, not really getting into that, or whether that's right or wrong, or whether that, has significant meaning behind it, but that is kind of their view on reality. Looking this up, Buddhism's view on reality and self. From the Buddhist perspective, the idea of individual self is an illusion. It is not possible to separate self from its surroundings. Buddha, things are not what they seem. Deeds exist, but, Buddhism teaches that reality, and this is where I believe Buddhism actually overlaps with Hinduism, or a few sects or many sects of Hinduism, in that a lot of Hindus believe that reality is an illusion. I think that in my limited research of Hinduism, there are certain sects of Hinduism that think that what we experience is reality, and what we experience is ourself and other people and all that is really the consciousness of a deity as he's meditating. So there really is no physical reality. There's nothing. There's emptiness. Which is a Buddha a teaching in Buddhism. um, just to demonstrate emptiness. Samyata, I think it's a Sanskrit word and how you pronounce it. Introduction. Emptiness literally translate the Sanskrit samyata. While variously interpreted, it always points to the absence of some ontological feature of substance or essence that living beings mistakenly superimpose upon phenomenon. Many but not all types of Buddhism teach that the ultimate nature of all things is in fact this absence. Reality is an illusion. The way in which we experience reality is an illusion. So the path to liberation from the cycle of rebirth involves encountering this ultimate nature in meditation, thereby ending the delusion that is the root of needless misery, suffering, thirst. Emptiness appears but is infrequently mentioned in the Pali Suttas that are the core scriptures of non-Mahayana forms of Buddhism, including the Theravada tradition and the historically important, I'm not going to try to pronounce that, you know, and it continues. This is actually interesting. However, emptiness is directly linked to Buddhist teachings on the lack of self, which is Adnatman, or Adnatta. I think I'm probably butchering that. The self that things lack is not merely personality or personhood, but precisely the exaggerated nature that living beings in delusion habitually superimpose. So the perception of reality from a Buddhist perspective and an Eastern perspective, I think some of this may even overlap with, I could be, but some of the other thoughts and philosophies in China and Korea and Japan, around around their understanding of reality. But I thought this was an interesting dive into the perspective on religion. What do we think of religion? Does that have any meaning behind it, or is it just kind of some vague term that doesn't really have a focused, defined view? And how does it relate to the major quote unquote religions of the world? And in studying other religions, again, I'm not an expert on any of this, but really, I think the truth is much stranger than fiction, in that Buddhism is a very, very different perspective on life than what most people would understand it to be. Particularly if you're not familiar with other world religions, if you're just a Christian in the United States and you don't really look at a lot of this. But you know, I thought this was an interesting video around different perspectives, around different ways of life, different understandings of reality. Um, I don't think this is the exact same as my earlier videos on the meaning of words, which I'll get back to. But I did think this was which is an interesting concept to dive into. Probably not a lot of people think this is interesting, but this kind of stuff fascinates me. It's just, the different perspectives and ideas and outlooks that people have on life. I mean, this is just so different from a purely materialistic, atheistic worldview, where the only thing that exists is the material. And I'm not saying all atheists believe that. There are plenty of atheists that don't believe that. They believe in the immaterial, such as forces and things like that. But there are atheists who, are the opposite end of the spectrum from, many Hindu sects, or I would argue Buddhist sects, that the only thing that exists and, the only thing that we experience in reality is purely physical. It's chemical processes and atoms and things like that. Whereas Buddhists, that they're on the opposite end when it comes to thoughts of reality around, none of this is real. It's all empty. reality is an illusion. The way that we experience reality is an illusion, and we must escape from that, and basically reach cessation of the cycle of rebirth. What that means, I would argue, ceasing to exist as a conscious being. But that's just kind of my Western perspective on it. But really, I think it's kind of interesting how atheism and Buddhism, they have a similar conclusion in that maybe the metaphysical illusion of oneself doesn't exist. There is no soul. There is no metaphysical consciousness that we can identify as a person or the self of a person or the being of a person. Really, that's an illusion. That's an illusion from a Buddhist perspective. It's just experiences of metaphysical concept, where atheists believe that is also an illusion. It's just the emergent properties of physical things, and there is no self, there is no consciousness as we experience it. It's just emergent properties of a mind that is really just a computer. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. I hope this was interesting to anyone else, but I appreciate anyone listening, and I'll see you on the next one.